Okay, we're opening up a topic here which is a can of worms. Representation is a topic that has occupied philosophers for donkey's years. It's something we can't get around in cognitive science. We always seem to be confronted with it no matter what approach we take to understanding minds, brains, and behavior. And at the root of this is the division between subject and object. If there's a knower and a known, that's a relationship between them. And if we separate the knower from the known, then we need to show what the nature of the knowledge is, what the connection is. So if mind and world are entirely separate, as many views would have it, then we have to come up with some story about how mind comes to know the world. And when we studied perception, we were looking at some aspects of this problem, and we were concerned with how we make sense of the world based on a specific kind of information. But there's a much broader question here which relates not only to our perceptual encounters, but to everything we know about everything. And when I make the questions involved so broad, it should be clear that there's not going to be a single unitary concept. And the word representation is so central to many arguments in cognitive science that we're going to need to unpack this notion a little bit in order to appreciate what's at stake in a variety of discussions. We're not going to have one story to tell, as usual. And I want to hold off on many of the complexities that arise by first of all grounding our intuitions a little bit, practicing, as it were, using a representational domain that we are hopefully entirely familiar with. So we're going to spend some time talking about maps. Not talking about brains, but talking about maps. We'll get to brains and stuff in a minute. But first of all, let me show you a picture. Has anybody ever been to Salt Lake City? Yes, so it exists, finally. I often have to take it on trust that it exists. I've never been there, and usually my students haven't been there. So I'm glad you can reassure me that Salt Lake City exists. And this is, of course, not Salt Lake City. This is a picture on the screen in Dublin. We are, let's be clear about that, we are in Dublin. We are not in Utah. On the screen in Dublin, there's a picture of some place, which I'm hoping is Salt Lake City, and there's also some words. And the words relate to or are about, in some sense, Salt Lake City. So here we have, we're a great remove from there, and we're forced to work with various forms of representations. Here we've got words and we've got images, and we're going to begin our consideration of Salt Lake City, which exists but is not here, with a map of Salt Lake City. There's a map of Salt Lake City, and it contains lots of information about Salt Lake City. This is an American city built out in the desert, so you can see all the block-like ordering of the streets, unlike a European city that grows organically over hundreds of years. Here everything is north, south, east, west, and you can see you can see big streets and small streets, principal buildings, parks up in the top right, or northeast, if you will. You can see some topographical features. There's a lot of information about Salt Lake City here. This is clearly about Salt Lake City in a meaningful, systematic sort of sense. But it's not the only map we could have of Salt Lake City. Here's another map of Salt Lake City. Now the scale has changed. We've zoomed right out. And there's an awful lot more information about the surrounding countryside, about the mountains. And something peculiar has happened to Salt Lake City itself. It's now represented using a which I'm very bad at drawing, a five-pointed star. Now, a five-pointed star is a bit odd, isn't it? It doesn't look like Salt Lake City. Now, there's nothing about Salt Lake, presume, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but there's nothing about Salt Lake City that is a five-pointed star. And yet, you know what? We're symbol users, we human apes. we have no trouble sort of dealing with the arbitrary intrusion of a symbol we've never met before in a highly symbolic domain like a map. And it doesn't seem to worry us too much that we've moved from this kind of overt representation to this kind of symbolic representation. And it's becoming very clear that there are very many ways in which you could represent Salt Lake City in a map. Here's another map of Salt Lake City. There's an infinite number of maps of Salt Lake City. This one has different kinds of information. It's at an intermediate scale. This one adds something, though, that we didn't see before. It adds a legend over here on the right-hand side. And in the legend, the correspondence between elements in the map and elements on the ground is made explicit. So various kinds of roads, various symbols that are employed, there's a scale there. And the legend helps us in decoding this, even though we're pretty good in the absence of a legend. If there's very specific information, we'd like to have a legend. It helps us. And what we can see here is that there's a lot of different kinds of information about Salt Lake City. Some things are made perfectly explicit. The names of things, for example, are perfectly explicit. We can just read them off on the maps. Another kind of information you can get from a map is the distance between 2 points. Now, if you were interested in the distance on the ground, as you would travel by road, you've got to do a bit of work here. What you do is you take a piece of string or something and put it down over the route you want to measure, and then lift up your piece of string and compare it to the scale. And that tells you how far it would be in the real world after you do a little bit of mathematical conversion. So information about distances is present in the map, but it's implicit. You have to work hard to get at it. Whereas some other information, like the names of things, is explicit. It's right there just for the taking. So there's different ways that things are represented here. And there's lots that's not represented here. So in all the maps we've seen, there's nothing at all that will inform me about how Salt Lake City smells, or what the sounds of Salt Lake City are, or what it feels like to be there, and whether the people are nice, and what the food is like. And there's an infinite number of things about Salt Lake City that is just not on the maps. There is no conceivable representation of Salt Lake City that would, as it were, exhaust Salt Lake City. A map is always partial. It always selects certain kinds of detail and information and rejects or leaves behind others. So the things on the map stand for things in Salt Lake City, and they do so in a variety of ways. And I'd like to just consider these symbols that we might need. So the top two there look like airplanes, but if you saw them on a map, you wouldn't think that they stood for a specific airplane. You'd think that they stood for an airport, because you're all very good at using maps, right? And obviously it doesn't matter whether it's a black airplane or a white airplane, because it's not about being a specific airplane. It's not about similarity. The presence of a silhouette of an airplane clues you in that there's going to be an airport there. What about the third one down? That's a symbol that you might find. Where would you find that symbol, first of all? In your car. On the dashboard of your car. And if it comes on, you're in trouble. And what's the trouble you're in? Oil. You need oil. But the oil can shown there is a bit geriatric. How many of you have ever used an oil can like that? And if you're in trouble because you need oil and you go to the garage and you get oil, you will never see an oil can like that. So there's a certain amount of history built in here, a certain amount of convention established after a period of time. When you go to save a document in Microsoft Word, the save icon is a little picture of a floppy disk. How many of you use floppy disks? You still use floppy disks? No, not anymore. But you have used them in the past. They do exist. Those kind of oil cans did exist. I mean, they still do exist. They're just rather rare. It's not the usual way that you add oil to your car, and a floppy disk is not the usual way that you save your documents. But there was a period in which the association was clear, and then the technology changed, but we still needed to save our documents. So we end up with a symbol that has a bunch of history built into it. It used to have some kind of iconic similarity to physical medium. Now it doesn't. Its association is purely conventional, and you can save your documents without ever having met a floppy disk in your life. What about the bottom one? A red circle with a line through it. Now I'm not giving you much in the way of context here. So the oil can appears in a specific place. It appears in a specific context, which is in the dashboard of your car. It would be very odd to find it somewhere else. The red circle with a line through it appears in a lot of contexts. What's its general sense? Don't do it. Don't. It's prohibited. Do not do this. Yeah? It doesn't say what's prohibited. So if we put a P in the middle of it, it'll say no parking. If we put it up beside an entrance, you might interpret it as don't go in there. It's a general sort of sense of prohibition. Here's a Russian prankster has made a no prohibiting sign. Okay? So signs occur in specific ecosystems. And the meaning of a symbol, anyway, is going to depend on what the ecosystem is in which it finds itself, what the system is in which it functions. And we move between such systems all the time. You're reading text and you're looking at images, and around you are signs from very different systems. We've got emergency exit signs up there, which are part of an entirely different ecosystem of signs. And we humans are really good at this. We are immersed in lots and lots of what we might call semiotic systems or sign-based systems all the time. Now I want to turn to these. There's a sense in which these are representations in that what we're looking at are traces of past events. The events are gone, they're no longer present. Someone somewhere pressed their lips against a piece of glass on top. Someone somewhere pushed a hand into a piece of clay on the bottom. In each case, the event is gone, it's history. We don't know who did this. What we have left is a trace that is causally related to the event that happened. These are imprints, so there's a sense in which these are about something that's not present, as the map is about Salt Lake City, but there's a very different way in which they're about something that's not present. There's no artifice, there's no convention, there's no systems here. Rather, these are imprints that bear a direct causal trace to what happened before. And it's interesting that these two leave something behind, so we can no longer tell who did this. Based on the visual information alone, we can no longer tell anyway whether this was a man or a woman, or what color the skin was, or what they were wearing, or why this happened. There's lots of stuff we can't tell. But there's some stuff we can tell. There was 2 lips involved, there's 4 fingers and a thumb on the hand. And we could even take this piece of clay, if it were still soft, and we could stretch it or compress it and change the size of the hand, but you'd still see it was a hand. There'd still be a principled lawful relationship between the imprint and the original event of a hand meeting clay. There are certain changes you wouldn't make. You wouldn't reverse the picture. You'd have to cut the clay in order to change the order of the fingers. Just by stretching and compressing it, you're not going to change that. So if all you do is stretch and compress it, you're not going to, there's certain kinds of information that are preserved despite that. So from the source event to the imprint, we have some kind of a translation in which some properties are preserved and some properties are lost and modified and they're absolutely not recoverable. So now we've seen several different ways in which things can be about something that's not present. We've got this completely bizarre, arbitrary 5-pointed star standing for Salt Lake City, and yet it didn't cause us any problems because it occurred in a specific context in which it's quite conventional for a symbol to bear a lot of information. The word Salt Lake City will be right beside it, and it's on a map of Utah. So we have no problem dealing with this, even though it's somewhat arbitrary. And we've seen symbols that exist within an ecosystem of signs that have specific meanings tied to those ecosystems, the oil light on the car. We've seen symbols that bear some kind of iconic resemblance to something, like the airplane, but they don't mean an airplane, they mean an airport. So there's rakes of convention built in here. And of course, convention is entirely normal in a symbol using system, so the words are an example of largely conventional signs that stand for something else. If I say the word horse, those sounds there bear no necessary relationship to a four-legged animal, and if I spoke a different language I would make different sounds and they would still be about the horse. We've seen that information can be explicit or implicit. Sometimes we have to work hard to get at some information, and sometimes it's right there for the plucking. We've seen the difference between something which exists in an ecosystem with this degree of formality, and these that are also about something that's not present, but in a different way, without convention, with a causal relationship. So those are all going to be useful aspects of the much broader sense of how is something about something else that we need to interrogate, and those distinctions will be helpful in what goes on. And cognitive scientists are kind of odd in this respect. You know, if you're an inorganic chemist or you're an astronomer, you don't have to worry really much about this. If you're studying the moons of Jupiter, you don't have to worry about representation. You don't have to worry about what the moon is about. The red spot on Jupiter is not about something, it's just something that happens. And inorganic chemists playing around with their coppers and sulfates and so on don't ask what one thing is about. I said inorganic chemists because organic chemists deal with the processes of life. And there, such questions suddenly arise because antibodies are about pathogens and receptors, and biological systems are all about, there's lots of relations where one part of a system can be seen to be about another part of a system. So this kind of meaning-making, things being about something else, seems to arise with the processes of life. And when we turn to cognitive science, of course, we're interested in knowledge, so we're really interested in how all this works, how the stuff we know, the stuff we think, how it relates to the world. So we're going to first just note that these imprints are quite different from the symbols. And when we're dealing with symbols, we're dealing with systems. And there are representational systems in which we say that something represents something else. If it stands in correspondence to it, so that square with an airplane stands in correspondence to an airport on the ground, and it plays that role within a system because it has that relationship of correspondence. So that square with an airplane has to occur in a special place, has to occur on a map, so you can identify it as being situated in a particular place elsewhere with particular geographical relations. So that way of being about something is quite different from the imprint way. And when the relationship between the sign and the thing the sign is about, or the signified, is arbitrary, well, this happens all the time, and we have many different such systems. That sign up there, that pi, we call that, it's a letter. And the Greeks used to use that for writing, so it's part of their alphabet. And then the mathematicians came along and stole it. Well, they didn't, they left it behind, but they borrowed it. And now in the mathematical ecosystem, it means something else. It means the ratio of the circumference to the diameter of a circle, which is a number, 3.14 blah. And clearly that's an arbitrary relationship. It doesn't resemble a circle, it doesn't resemble a number. They just chose that, and they could have chosen anything else. Those two prohibition signs in the middle show us that things are not quite that cut and dried. So here we have the obviously arbitrary red circle with the line through it, meaning prohibition, and in this case they both seem to mean no fishing. But they illustrate that in different ways. One chooses to show the fish, one chooses to show a fisher person. Either one works, so there's no given way that a sign saying no fishing has to look. When you encounter such a sign, it's going to be in a place where it makes some kind of sense. There's no point in putting a no fishing sign where there's no possibility of fish. So these symbols function in an ecosystem of signs in which we expect certain kinds of directions. Traffic signs constitute an entire ecosystem with a whole bunch of conventions, and that's entirely distinct from the set of signs that alert you to the condition of your computer, for example, to the location of your files. So as we're asking how is something about something else, we're very interested in the degree to which such relations are arbitrary or conventional, and the degree to which they have certain aspects of non-arbitrariness, all the way down to causal relationships like our imprints. Now, all that discussion was just to warm us up, to get us thinking about representations and how something can be about something else in a way that avoids a lot of the problems, because we're familiar with these things. We're familiar with all these signs we've used. We know how maps work. Everything's fine. Now we're going to turn to brains. And we're going to use these concepts as we think about representations and cortical maps. There's that word map again. But I want to caution you, although we're going to look at things that are conventionally described as maps, we're going to find that they more resemble imprints than they do those maps that we just saw. So the nature of the relationships we're about to look at are often described as representational, and we're going to ask, what does that mean? So we've met one of these before. When we were discussing vision, we noted the weird plumbing in which the eyes project through the optic nerve, and a bit of detail, into the back of the brain. You all remember that. Drawn not at all to scale up there on the top. And those projections are systematic, such that if 2 points are close together on the retina, they project to 2 points close together in occipital primary visual cortex. So the spatial layout, certain aspects of the spatial layout on the retina are retained through these transformations. Places near each other remain near each other. Places far away remain far away. So this is not a relationship like I'm answering my own question here. It's not a symbol-like relationship. It's more like the causal relationship of the hand, of the imprint of the hand to the event that gave rise to it. You could say, if you will, that the imprint represents the event rather than represents the event. But those are linguistic games. You understand that there's a systematic connection between the retina and the primary visual cortex, and that does not depend on arbitrary, especially language-based conventions or any form of systematicity. We met this before. This is a schematic diagram of the retina at the top, which is the back of the monkey's eye, schematically divided into 3 zones: the fovea, where vision is sharpest, perifoveal area, and periphery. And then we project to the back of the monkey's brain, which has been shown here opened up like this. So to reconstruct that brain, you have to fold those 2 exposed sides together. And you can see that the fovea, the perifovea, and the periphery are all represented there, but there's been some significant changes as well. That is, the fovea has grown in proportion relative to the other areas, and the periphery has shrunk. Remember what we said about that hand imprint in the clay. Oh, there we go, we've got a light out, doesn't matter. Remember we said that we could take the clay and we could stretch it and we could compress it. Now, there's certain changes that are not going to happen. We're not going to reverse the order of the fingers. We may change their relative size, but basic patterns of connectivity are going to be preserved. Well, that's exactly what we see here. We're seeing this kind of stretching and compression. And we find this not only in vision, we find it in touch too. So what's shown here is the primary somatosensory cortex. That's that blue sausage-shaped thing right behind primary motor cortex. This is at the frontmost part of the parietal lobe. And this is where the projections from the skin go to register soft touch. So if I touch my hand here on the outside, there's a part of my primary somatosensory cortex about here that will register that. That is, there'll be nervous system activity connected with this here. And so we have a mapping, a projection from the skin onto this sausage-shaped piece of brain. Now, there's no way to map the entire surface of the body onto this sausage-shaped piece of brain without some cuts. So you can see the head here is one thing, but then there's a discontinuity as we move into the hand and arm and trunk. And once more you can see these characteristic distortions, so that the amount of cortical real estate devoted to the lips and the fingers is much greater than that devoted to the knees or the elbows. And your knees and elbows, frankly, are not, unless you're really weird, they're not that sensitive, right? Your lips are much more sensitive than your knees. So this also makes sense. This is often described as a representation. So we can see that the somatosensory cortex bears a non-arbitrary relationship to the surface of the skin. In fact, we can reconstruct the homunculus with all those distortions, and this is what it looks like. Kind of grotesque, but you can see that it's quite easy to understand the sense in which this arrangement of the cortex is related to or is about the surface of the body. In that sense, these are representations, and we use the word map for this, but it's quite unlike the maps of Salt Lake City. It's more like the imprint. We find this in one other modality as well, which is in hearing or audition. This is the brain of a cat. Shown here, this is its temporal lobe, this is primary auditory cortex, and this is the sensitivity of various neurons there to the frequencies of sounds from high frequency on the left to low frequency on the right. And that arrangement corresponds to the different sensitivities of the basilar membrane in the inner ear, where we find a receptor surface organized from high frequencies to low frequencies. So this is a tonotopic map organized by frequency. It's not the spatial map of the primary somatosensory cortex or the retinal map of the visual system. But once more, we see something very similar. These three modalities share something very important. Somatotopic, retinotopic, and tonotopic maps are all classically described as representations, but you need to understand what sense that word is being used. It's in this causal sense in which the projections are non-arbitrary, such that spatial relations on the sensory surface are preserved in the cortex. If we start to think of the neural activity in the cortex as being about things in the world rather than the sensory surface, then we're using the word representation in a very, very different sense. So these maps do represent in a specific way, but they don't represent in the same way as a symbol. And we can follow these projections, these translations, from the sensory surface to the primary auditory cortex. It's lawful, we can comprehend it, we've learned a great deal about it, but there are representational questions we have that are of a completely different nature. And it's to those that we want to turn now, beyond cortical maps. You remember last day we talked about propositions when we were discussing reasoning. And propositions was this weird view of language, of specific sentences in language, as if they could be about the world in terms that were either true or false. So the cat is on the mat is a proposition, which is true if the cat is on the mat, and is false if the cat is not on the mat. And that's all a bit weird, because we haven't said which cat, which mat, what we mean by on, what time we're talking about, or anything else. So there are serious logical questions that arise when we start to say a sentence is about a state of affairs in the world. But, you know, we have to address this. And so here's a cat thinking about a cheeseburger. There's a thinking cat. It's thinking about a cheeseburger. And the cheeseburger is not present. So one question that we might have is, in what sense are the thoughts of this cat about a cheeseburger? Do they represent the cheeseburger? Does that representation have to resemble a cheeseburger? Is it purely arbitrary? Is it conventional? Are there any properties of that that would be cheeseburger-ish? Well, these are big questions. If we assume that that thinking that the cat is doing corresponds to nervous system activity, to the firings of neurons, then we want to ask, what is it about a pattern of a particular set of neural firings that can stand for a cheeseburger within whatever this thinking system is? And we can ask, does that representation have to have any cheeseburger-like properties? So I chose to draw. I gave you an image of a cheeseburger there. I didn't use the word cheeseburger. Here's a cheeseburger in sentences, but I've kept using the image just to mix it up a little bit, so I've got language and images going on. And remember, we met Jerry Fodor's language of thought hypothesis, where the idea was that for certain ways of understanding thinking, there seem to be properties of thought that are very like properties of language. And we had the term mentalese to describe this. Well, I'm messing with this a little bit here by using language-like representations, but sticking an image in that sort of looks like a cheeseburger. I can mess with it some more. There you go. The mathematicians stole that symbol off the Greeks. Now I'm stealing it off the mathematicians to use an Eric Cartman-like sentence. I want a pie, meaning a thing you could eat, right? So Symbols can be misappropriated, taken out of one regime, inserted into another regime, and here we now have the pi doing duty in a linguistic sense. In a propositional representation, there's obviously no need for the individual elements, like words or symbols, to resemble what they're about. Once more, the Greek letter doesn't look like a pie, it's not made of pastry, you can't eat it, right? We've met this before. This is a very influential view of what thinking is, and it's been very important in the computational theory of mind, in which a lot of cognition, a lot of thinking, reasoning, planning, imagining is understood as being the manipulation of symbols, language like symbols, according to rules. That's been central to the computational theory of mind, a view, a specific metaphor that has been very, very rich and that only came into being in the second half of the 20th century. But lots of people are not happy with this because there's lots of aspects to our thought that are not captured by this. So we need to acknowledge that, and one of the biggest objections to this, and one of the most serious and ongoing discussions in cognitive science, the one that's generated more battles, more arguments, more wasted paper than anything else, has been between those who think that we think in terms of propositions or symbols, and those who say, no, we think in terms of images. So now I want you all to do something. I want you to picture a hippopotamus in your mind. Okay? Picture that hippopotamus. I'm going to be querying you about that. There's mine. How many people thought of a blue hippopotamus? Cool. We share a hippopotamus. How many people are sure that they know what color their hippopotamus was? How many people are unsure? How many people thought of a non-conventionally colored hippopotamus? How many people know what their hippopotamus was standing on? Was it, okay, was it, I mean, you might have, I'm not telling you what you imagined, right? I'm asking you to query what you imagined, and every time I suggest something, it's going to mess with what you queried, because, like, you probably didn't think of your hippopotamus wearing Wellington boots, but you are now, so that's a problem. Was it standing on concrete? Was it standing in a jungle? Was it in the grass? Was it in County Kerry? Was it swimming in the water? Were there other hippopotami around? You're probably losing all sense of security about what it was that you imagined like this. But an interesting thing is we can ask those kinds of questions. We can ask, was your hippopotamus facing to the right or facing to the left? Sentences don't face one way or the other, but images do. Right? Hands up, everyone who had a hippopotamus that was either facing right or facing left. Hands up who had a hippopotamus which was facing neither way. Was it facing straight on? Yeah, it was facing some way, right? Sentences don't face. So we can ask this about an imagistic-like representation. And thinking about images is one thing can be in front of another. I don't know what way you imagined your hippopotamus, but it's quite possible there were other elements in that picture. It's quite possible that you imagined a hippopotamus and it wasn't fully specified, so that you didn't imagine it as being one colour or another. Did your hippopotamus necessarily have a tail? As I add more detail, you're going to change the hippopotamus that was represented. We'll start talking about the wrinkles on the skin and all those kinds of things. Here's the thing about images. Sometimes if you meet an image, you say, oh, that's an image of a hippopotamus. So supposing you meet a picture of a hippopotamus, and then you look at it for a while and you go, oh, look, there's other things there I didn't think of. Can your imagined images do that? Can they present things to you like a real picture can that you didn't think of? Well, we've just waded into the great mental imagery debate, in which people who are interested in the logical language-like properties of thought clash with people who are interested in the image, picture-like elements of thought. So there's interesting differences between these two. Images, in some sense, resemble what they stand for. Now, there's a lot more we could say about that, but they do so, they bear a relationship that's quite unlike the relationship of words. Words clearly have a purely conventional relationship, normally to the thing they stand for. But with images, sometimes there's convention, but sometimes there's not. And if we're going to think of the brain as a big symbol crunching machine, like a computer, then these are very interesting questions that are going to greatly alter the way we think it works. Asking questions is easy. How about doing some experiments? On some famous experiments by Shepard and Metzler, called the mental rotation experiments, presented people with pairs of things like this and asked them to use the power of their mind to figure out whether these are conceivably the same shape or not. Who thinks these are the same shape? Who thinks they're not the same shape? They are the same shape, and yet what you're doing is mentally rotating one to sort of land on the other, and you go clunk. That works. Right? Try this one. Yes or no? Hands up who thinks yes. Hands up who thinks no. The right answer is yes. Doesn't matter. Here's another one. The right answer for this is no. Try it out for yourselves. Sorry, it kind of breaks your brain when you do all this rotation and then you find it doesn't meet. So sorry if that's distressing. What's important here is that you can vary the amount that you would have to rotate a physical object in order to check the alignment. And what they measured was the amount of time people took to respond. And the more you would have to rotate a physical object, the longer it took people to respond. That's from 0 to 180 degrees. Beyond that, we're going around in circles. So it's just this rising part of the graph that's of interest. It takes longer to respond on difference trials, where the answer is no, than on same trials. I think you felt that when you see that they're the same, you're finished. When you see they're not the same, you might have messed up and you kind of have to go do it again. So that's not surprising. But this is a very, very lawful relation. This has been replicated 1,000 ways to Sunday. Clearly, whatever way people are doing this involves something that has geometric properties, right? The amount of time taken to respond to a given display depends on the amount of time, the amount of physical rotation that would be necessary if they were actual three-dimensional objects. So geometry matters, and geometry does not matter in sentences. Propositions have no geometry. They have linear ordering, but they don't have this spatial character. So this is indirect evidence that something like an image-based representation is at work here. Just 1 second. Now, I'm recording this for my own purposes. So, let's go on. We have indirect evidence now that when people are thinking through this task, they're using something that is not purely language-like. So, Jerry Fodor, I'm not sure. Now, this really matters. The way that you represent something determines what you can do with it. Numbers give us a clear and easy example. Down on the bottom, you've got two numbers. They're represented in two ways. On the left-hand side, you have Arabic numerals. Very simple. On the right-hand side, you have Roman numerals. They both represent the same abstract quantities, numbers. But if you want to add them, I don't know if you've ever tried adding with Roman numerals. It's a disaster. Multiplication is almost impossible with Roman numerals. The Romans were brilliant at building things, building roads and doing plumbing and aqueducts and all kinds of things, but they were rotten at calculation because they were fettered by this unwieldy system that was great for carving into stone, but no good for doing mathematics with. So the way that even though these represent the same thing, the choice of representation determines what you can do with them. Right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to expand on this and look at the way that something is represented affects what you can do with it. And remember our maps. Remember back that some information was just ready to hand. You could just read off the name of things. Other information you really had to work hard to get at, like the distance between things. And some information was not present. So, I hope you all remember what a phone book is. This is in pre-computer days. If I gave you a phone book and said, look up the number of Mr. Thelonious Winterbottom, you would take the phone book and you would confidently open it towards the back. You would home in on the letter W, and you would very quickly report back to me the number of Mr. Thelonious Winterbottom. Even though there might be 100,000 phone numbers in the book, you would get there really, really quickly, right? But if I give you the same phone book and say, who owns that number? The information is in the book, because the book consists of pairs of names and numbers, but they're organized by name, they're not organized by number, so that to solve this task you would have to start at the first entry, check the second entry, you'd have to go through them in sequence. You'd probably miss it, you might have to do this multiple times. It would be disastrously difficult to answer this question, simply because of how the data are represented, because of the organization of the phone book. So you can see that when it comes to phone books and numbers, the representations we choose determine what we can do with them. So here's one more. Now what we're going to do is we're going to ask about your knowledge. Because you know lots of stuff, and we're interested in hearing how your knowledge is represented. Supposing I asked you, name 3 bands who are a bit like the Beatles. I don't care. I don't care what your answer is. I'm quite sure you could do this. Maybe you might mention things like the Beach Boys or the Rolling Stones, bands from the 60s, bands from Liverpool. There's lots of ways you could answer this. They'd all be fine. They'd all be right. You could, I think, answer this question. That's clear, right? Now, supposing instead I ask you, name 3 bands where the 4th letter of their name is U. Well, you sort of can answer this as well. Because you can think of a band like Rolling Stones and go, nope. Okay, think of it like Beatles, nope. And that's what it's a bit like looking up the number without the name in the phone book, because whatever way your knowledge about bands is organized, it's not organized by spelling. Right? It just isn't. Yes, that knowledge is there, but it's implicit. And so clearly, whatever way your knowledge about bands is organized supports things like genre, decade, geography, but not spelling. So let's move into a more better studied domain than bands. Let's ask about English phonology. If I say, name 3 words that rhyme with flap. Come on, give me 3 words that rhyme with flap. Rap?
Flap.
Flap, clap. Okay, we're there. That was easy. Whatever way you store English words supports lookup by rhyme. We just demonstrated that. Right? So phonologists are really interested in this. We just learned a fundamental fact about English and your knowledge of English, which is that rhyme is really important in the way it's represented. So there's a really, really important lesson here. Challenges 1 and 2 refer to the phone book lookup. And you can see that the information in the phone book is organized in a way that makes it easy to find a number given a name, but makes it almost impossible, not quite impossible, but very difficult to find a name given a number. That changed with computers, of course. You just reorganize them. So the knowledge in the phone book is represented in a specific fashion, and the way that it's represented greatly influences what you can do with it, how it can be accessed and manipulated. But then we moved on and we asked questions about your knowledge, your secret, hidden, I don't know where you keep it, maybe in your brain, maybe in your spleen. But you know something about bands and you know something about English phonology. And by asking the right questions, we were able to uncover some aspects about that. We were able to determine that your knowledge of bands is not organized by spelling. And we were able very quickly to determine that your knowledge of English words supports lookup by rhyme. So rhyme is going to be a really important organizing principle in English phonology, as indeed it is. There's lots of work to support that. So you can see we've started on a very, very large topic here. We've only started going down the road. We're going to occupy ourselves some more with representation on Tuesday. But we should never believe that there's a single question at issue here. Frequently in cognitive science, debate revolves around something called mental representations. And since the first lecture, I think it's been clear that we need to be cautious because we're not clear what we mean when we say mental, any more than we're clear what we mean when we say physical. Those are difficult words. When we unpack it here, and when we use familiar examples like maps to hone our intuitions, we can see that the term representation, which means how is one thing about something that's not present, that unfolds into a variety of senses, some of which need to lean on arbitrary conventional relationships, some of which need to lean on systematicity, some of which are purely causal and are completely different. They do not require that kind of systematicity. And all of these are going to be relevant as we explore the topic further. We'll pick this up again on Tuesday.